B.Sc first semester in subject Botany, we are going to study about 5 to 7 units. So these units, in brief, to give an outline of the syllabus in the B.Sc first semester. So we are studying about viruses, bacteria, algae, fungi, archegoniates, bryophytes, pteridophytes and gymnosperms. So today we shall study about the unit on algae. So in algae we are studying the general characteristics of algae, classification of algae, ecology and distribution, and reproduction in algae. So algae, when we say, so this group of organisms, they are chlorophyll containing organisms in general. So majority of the algae, they contain chlorophyll plus other pigments. Now when we come to the classification of algae, so various scientists, they classify according to their own system. But here we are studying in general about algae. So algae are organisms which are not having a well differentiated root, stem and leaf. So such kind of plant body, an organized body, is called as thallus. So in algae we find thallus. All algae, whichever type they are thalloid organization. And when we say there are no roots, stem and leaves, so definitely they are non-vascular organisms. They don't contain any kind of vascular tissues like xylem and phloem. So hence the tissue which is present, it is mostly parenchymatous, simple kind of tissue, plant tissue. So this algae organisms which are having thalloid organisms, so they are non-vascular. So in addition, the reproduction also is very simple. But however, when we come to the different groups of algae, in case of primitive algae, we find a simple type of reproduction like vegetative reproduction. And as we go on in the well-developed forms of algae, we find asexual and sexual type of reproduction methods. So that is just about a brief account of algae. And these algae, they are present in different kinds of habitats. So this general characteristics of algae is mainly they are thalloid. That is the main important character. And they are non-vascular. Then reproduction takes place in different methods. Then when we come to the ecology and the distribution of algae, so in what habitats they are distributed and how they are found in different kinds of habitats. So in general characteristics, when we come to see, here algae are mostly multicellular, and there are also certain unicellular algae, but very few. For example, Chlamydomonas, which is a green algae, it is unicellular, and so when it is unicellular, usually they are having motile cells, so they are having a pair of flagella. So with the help of flagella, so they can move, or they are having the power of locomotion, and thus they are motile in nature. But whereas certain non-motile, especially in case of multicellular organisms, so we find non-motile organisms, and so there is no locomotion, and they are stagnant, or they remain permanent at a particular kind of place. Now coming to the ecology and the distribution of algae, where they are found. So algae is found in aquatic and also in terrestrial mode of ecosystems. But however, majority of the algae, they are aquatic. So when we say aquatic, so there are some freshwater forms and there are some marine forms, and there are certain other, for example, in shallow waters also they are found either submerged or they are floating as a planktons. So we find majority of the algae in aquatic systems, aquatic medium. Some of the algae are also terrestrial. So terrestrial means they are not found on dry lands, but they are found in wet areas, moist soils. Either they may be in rocks or like that. There are this is how the ecology is distribution. Then when we come to the other aspects, so these algae, they are certain algae, they are found in different habitats also. In aquatic, in terrestrial, and when we say in terrestrial, of course the basic character, the important character of algae is they contain chlorophyll. So definitely they are autotrophic, in other words. That means they are capable of preparing their own food material, so that means they are photosynthetic in function. So in addition to the chlorophyll, some algae also contain other pigments like red, yellow, brown, orange, etc. Now these algae, they are also found as epiphytes and they are also found as epizoics, and so there are different habitats. They also grow on other plant parts like that. So depending upon that, we come across different types of algae, that is distribution. And when we say about the ecology, so already we have mentioned some are unicellular. So when they are unicellular means they are microscopic in nature. That means they cannot be seen by the help of the naked eye. So when they are found in large populations, we can see the color or the some appearance of that algae, presence of that algae. But in case of multicellular, so there, however, there are also microscopic multicellular algae. For example, volvox, pandorina, eudorina. So they are found in microscopic form. They are also unicellular, but they are found in colonies. But there are certain algae which grow to a very large size, and they grow as kelps in the water, especially the brown algae and also some red algae. They grow inside the sea water. They are marine and they are found attached to the shallow waters, certain substratum, solid substratum like rocks or any other hard parts of the plants like that. So they get attached and then they grow to a very large height. When we see the morphology of those algae, they appear like normal angiosperm plants. So such algae, they are having some leaf-like structures. They are having also some stem and branches and also some root-like structures. But they are not true roots, but they are not true stem branches and true leaves. So such algae, which are usually referred as the kelps, they grow to a large height. For example, algae which is called as macrocystis, which grows up to 60 meters in height to a very large extent, and it forms a thick vegetation like appearance inside the water. So that is how the ecology of the algae that is distributed. Now according to the habitat, means in which form of environment they are growing. So we are having different types of algae. For example, aquatic, this terrestrial algae. So aquatic means already we have mentioned they may be found in fresh water or they may be found in marine like sea water. that is aquatic type of algae. And rarely algae are found in running water. For example, in streams they are very rare, but most of the algae are found in algae that is free floating planktonic and submerged type of systems. Then if you come to the terrestrial, we find algae growing in the damp soils, that is the moist soils, soils which are containing the water content, and certain algae also grow beneath the soil, below the soil surface, and for example Botridium, Frischilla are some algae which are found in such kind of habitat. And there are also algae which are called as Aerophytes. So Aerophytic algae they are called as. So such algae they are found on aero means air actually, so above the soil surface in the air medium. Actually they are not found floating in the air, but they are found growing on the tree trunks or also on branches and also on the leaves and also on the rocks or moist rocks, and even on the fencing wires. So if there are fencing wires, even on the fencing wire we find some algae which are found growing, and for example Peridium and Hapalosiphon is one example of such aerophytes. Then there is one more type of algae which is called as Cryophytic algae or Cryophytes. So cryo means actually low temperature. For example, when we hear the word cryogenic, so cryogenic engines means they are having a type of environment which is below 0 degree centigrade. So here the same thing, there are certain algae which are found in the snow, growing on the mountains which are covered with snow. In such areas we find certain algae, and these algae they give a kind of color to that snow. Suppose if in a mountain when that algae is found growing on the snow, if it is red algae, that snow appears red in color, so overall that mountain appears red in color. So that means they impart that particular color to the mountains which is covered with snow. There are algae which are also imparting yellow color, and there are also algae which are imparting certain brown color or even purple kind of pigment they contain, and so that color is given to that particular area or the mountain area. So then there are also algae which are growing in a very high temperature. So even up to 85 degrees centigrade we find algae which are growing in certain hot springs, and they can tolerate such kind of temperature. For example Oscillatoria, which is usually the blue green algae, and Cyanococcus algae, it can remain in high temperatures like hot springs and certain other regions where the temperature is very high. They are called as Thermophiles. So there is one more type of algae, and when we speak of these habitats, there are certain unusual habitats. So those algae which are grown in unusual habitats, they are of different types again. For example, when we speak of this, there are certain algae which are called as halophytic algae. So these halophytic algae, halogens, which is a word which is used in chemistry, so salt containing or like that. So this halogenic algae, they are found in high salt water, so not the algae which is growing in normal marine water, so that is different. But there are algae which they grow in very high percentage of salt water, so that means it is a normal medium for them, and such algae For example, Duna lila is one of the algae which is found in halophytic. Then there is one more type of algae which is called as Lithophytic algae. So litho means actually rock. Algae which are found on the moist rocks, and they are called as Lithophytic algae, and even on the wet walls they are also lithophytic. So this is in case of certain brown algae like Ectocarpus, and even certain red algae like Polysiphonia. Then Epiphytic algae. Epiphytes, these are plants which grow on other plants. So when they are growing on other plants, it does not mean they are parasitic. So they never depend for nutrition on the host plant. So they are called as epiphytes. The orchids are epiphytes. Similarly, there are certain algae which are epiphytic algae. So such epiphytic algae, they grow on the leaves, stem, and other parts of the plant of aquatic plants. For example, Idogonium, which is a green algae. So this Idogonium grows on the surface of the leaves, on the stem and its branches of submerged plants. So such algae, though they are growing on the leaves and stem, they never depend on this nutrition. They do not absorb any food from the leaves or the host plant. Instead, the host plant provides a place for their growth. That's all we can see in the epiphytic algae. So epiphytes, they never harm the host plant. It is in general. So orchids, when we see, they grow on other plants. For example, the orchid, they are commonly seen on mango plants and many other plants. So when they are growing on the branches of that plant, they just require a place for their growth, and they want to be suspended above, and they do not remain floating or like that. So they the place is provided by the host plant. The nutrition is not provided. And similarly, when we are speaking of plants, it is also in case of animals. There are algae which are called as Epizoic algae. So Epizoic algae, just like epiphytes which are growing on other plants, these are algae which are growing on animals. For example, the calcareous shell of snails or any mollusca phylum we can take. So on the surface of the calcareous shell, there are certain algae growing, and they do not harm the body of that organism or any part of that organism. And similarly, there are algae which are growing on the fins of the fishes. So on certain fins of the fishes, so they grow, and thus they are epizoic in nature. And even on the surface of the turtles, sea turtles or any other turtles, they are called as epizoic algae. And there is one more type of algae which is called as Endozoic algae. So epiphytic, epizoic, Endozoic. So epi means actually above, on the surface, but endo means inside. So there are certain algae which are found inside the body of the animals, but they do not harm any other part of that organisms. And for example, there is one algae called as Zoochlorella. That Zoochlorella algae is found inside the body of the hydra animal, which belongs to phylum Coelenterata. And similarly, Zooxanthella, another algae which grows inside the body of the freshwater sponges. So the sponges contain a cavity which is called as a spongocele. So inside the spongocele, so we find certain algae which are freely growing inside the cavity of that a particular animal. So that is called as Endozoic algae. Then in addition to this, there are some parasitic algae. So definitely the word itself suggests they are parasitic in nature. So usually when we speak of algae, the characters, we say that algae contain chlorophyll. But when they contain chlorophyll, that means they are independent, autotrophic. But there are certain algae which are parasitic but rare, one or two like that. So these algae, when they are parasitic, definitely they cause certain diseases in the plants. For example, Cephalourus is one algae which causes a kind of disease in coffee plant, that is red rust disease. So this red rust disease which causes in coffee plants by Cephalourus is an example of parasitic algae. And in addition to this, there is one more type of algae called as Symbiotic Algae. So the word itself, the meaning it gives, that symbiotic means it is a mutual kind of help between each other. So when there is a interaction or a kind of interrelationship between two organisms, whether it is a plant or animal, so when they are having mutual help, a kind of association such that they help each other, it is called as symbiotic relationship. And such kind of common examples we see in the leguminous plants, where the rhizobium bacteria which is found in the root nodules of the leguminous plants. So the bacteria helps in nitrogen fixation, and whereas the leguminous plant provides food and shelter to the rhizobium bacteria. So that is how the mutual help. So such kind of examples are there. But the same type of examples we come across in algae. So this chlorella algae, which helps the azotobacter. So the chlorella algae contains azotobacter which helps in the nitrogen fixation. That is the symbiotic algae. So like that, when we see the ecology and distribution, so we come to know that algae is found in various kinds of habitats. So there is variety of habitats for algae. But however, when we see this habitats, but majority of the algae are aquatic in nature. So this is the one habitat or the ecology and distribution of algae. But however, when we consider or when we compare the algae to the other organisms, for example plants, like whether it is bryophytes, pteridophytes or gymnosperms and angiosperms, so the major of the contribution by photosynthesis to the environment is by algae. So already we have mentioned algae contains chlorophyll. So by the help of the chlorophyll, they conduct photosynthesis and liberate oxygen to the atmosphere. So most of the oxygen which is liberated, it is by the algae. And so the algae contribution, when we study its their economic importance, we come to know that point. So algae, they are majority aquatic in nature. So most of the algae is found in fresh water, and there are also algae which are found in marine water, and the remaining few number of algae, they are found in different habitats like damp soils and on the bark of the tree trunks, and on the very low temperature, that is on the snow covered by the mountains. In high temperature like hot springs, there we find certain algae, and there are certain which are in unusual habitats, growing in very high salt content water and on the moist rocks, wet walls like that. And also they are found as epiphytic, growing on the leaves and stem on other plants, and also on the surface of the animals, like this calcareous shells of the mollusks, and even fins of the fishes. Then they are also found inside the body of the other animals. Then parasitic, they are causing disease. So when we say parasitic, means they are completely dependent on the host for nutrition. So when usually parasites are pathogenic, they cause diseases. So an example I have given, Cephalourus, an algae which is parasite on coffee plant, it causes a disease called as red rust disease. And the symbiotic means algae which are having a kind of association with other organisms which they exhibit symbiotic relationship. So this chlorella provides shelter for the azotobacter bacterium, and azotobacter helps in the fixation of the nitrogen, or it helps in the nitrogen fixation. So that is about ecological and distribution. Now if you come to the organization of the thallus, how the thallus of the algae is organized. So about the nature of the plant body. So in the general characteristics we have mentioned that algae are unicellular or multicellular. So that is about their structure. But how that multicellular is observed. So this organization of thallus. So when they are unicellular, so it is also referred as thallus. When it is multicellular, it is also a thallus. But in unicellular forms, we may find motile and non-motile. So example, Chlamydomonas we have mentioned as to how they are present. So in case of Chlamydomonas, so the cell, it is unicellular and having a pair of flagella like this. So this Chlamydomonas algae, which is unicellular, so it is a simple cell like, as in when we say amoeba. So amoeba is also unicellular organism, isn't it? It has a locomotion by the help of pseudopodia. And whereas another example unicellular like Paramecium, it is also unicellular. Euglena, it is also unicellular. So they are having the power of locomotion by cilia and as well as flagella. But Chlamydomonas is having a pair of flagella. So this flagella helps in locomotion. But there are certain unicellular algae where they are non-motile. In case of volvox, Pandorina, Eudorina, here the cells, they are non-motile, but however these cells, they link each other. They are somewhat having a kind of attachment. They attach each other to form a colony, and when they form the colony, some of the cells on the outer surface, they possess flagella and they help in locomotion. See, that means there is a kind of one kind of understanding between the cells there. So some of the cells which are inside, so they form a colony, a ball-like structure. They are attached by cytoplasmic threads and they are linked each other. They never separate. It is a kind of unity between them. They unite with each other. The cells which are at the periphery, they possess flagella like Chlamydomonas, and so the inner cells which are non-motile, which are not having flagella, so they are carried along by the other cells. So that is how there are also non-motile unicellular algae, and also there are motile unicellular algae. And then when we come to the other, that is colony like volvox, they are also unicellular. But in case of multicellular, when we come here, when they are made up of cells, so this multicellular, or they are in the form of filamentous. That means the cells which are present, for example, this is a cell. So these cells, they arrange in a row or in a line like this. So that single line of cells or the single row of cells is called as a filament. So this filament may be unbranched or branched. So in some algae, for example in blue-green algae, they are usually unbranched. But in case of higher algae, for example like Eulothrix, green algae, so there the filaments are somewhat branched and they are having a long filamentous nature that is highly branched is seen in such Eulothrix and even in Eudogonium and even in Wacheria and many other examples. And still when we see in higher forms of algae, so there we find some massive forms, we can say, means they grow somewhat to a large size. They are also multicellular, but the cells are not filamentous. Those multicellular structure appear like a stem, resembling a stem of a higher plants, angiosperm plants, and even there are leaf-like structures which are also resembling of higher plants, but however they are not true leaves, they are not true stems, and even they are not true roots. So such kind of roots they are called as rhizoids. So these rhizoids they help in attachment of that algae to rocks or to any hard surface like wet soils or something like that. And even these algae, certain algae, they are possessing a particular structure at the base of the algae plant body. There, that is called as the hold fast. There is a specific structure developed at the base of that algae, multicellular algae in case of massive forms. So that structure which is somewhat branched, which is having some finger-like projections, and they are having a certain grip or it holds to that substratum. So that is why that structure is referred as hold fast. So hold fast is seen in some higher forms, and that is seen in the higher algae, and especially in marine forms we see this, and also in the freshwater forms we can see. And already I had mentioned these massive forms, they grow to a very large height. They even grow up to about 60 meters in length, and these are grown in the shallow waters, marine waters. And some of the algae which are seen, they are usually called as kelps. So these kelps means such algae which are thickly grown or abundantly grown in that area. So they appear like a forest inside water. So usually when we say forest, it means that there are large number of plants growing where we cannot pass through that region easily. So the plants are thickly grown, the plants are abundantly grown, such that the movement is not so easy in that region, isn't it? So this we call forest on the land that we commonly see in certain regions. But inside water, usually we cannot move there. So inside water, if the same situation is there, so these massive forms of algae, when they are growing to several meters in height, so when they are found abundantly or thickly populated or heavily populated, so they form a kind of forest inside the water. So such kind of algae which are growing to a gigantic size, they form what are called as this kelps. So this is how the organization of the thallus is seen. Then after organization of the thallus, so this is in multicellular forms. Then when we come to the reproduction methods in algae, how the reproduction takes place. So there are three types of reproduction in algae. So this vegetative reproduction is one method. and where vegetative method is seen usually in the primitive type of algae, and even we see in the algae certain asexual methods and sexual methods. That is how this three types of methods we can see in the algae. Now vegetative methods is usually by fragmentation, especially in the multicellular algae, not in the unicellular. In unicellular it is a simple cell division by mitosis. So for example in Chlamydomonas, the cells divide by mitosis, they increase in number, and that is how the population increases and they reproduce by vegetative method. But in filamentous forms, there is a natural method called as fragmentation, that is in case of vegetation. And this vegetation method where the fragments break accidentally, each fragment which is consisting of a few number of cells, they do not die. Instead they divide, the cells divide and increase in their filament. That is in case of this filamentous forms. And there are other methods like harmogone formation. So harmogone formation is seen in case of certain blue-green algae. So in fragmentation what happens, the filament may break accidentally or due to some disturbances in that environment. Suppose if the algae is planktonic, that means it is floating. So due to the wave movements, the filaments may break into shorter segments, and each fragment is capable of developing into a new filament and increase in size and all that. And it may be the filaments may be broken by certain animals or certain other environmental factors. So that is in case of fragmentation. But when the environment or when there is no breakage of the filament by certain factors, so there are certain algae, they initiate their own method of fragmentation, that is by harmogone formation. So in a filament where the row of cells are present, now suppose if these are the cells, so when the filament goes on increasing in length, so where the filament does not break by any means, either by waves or any other accidental methods, so what happens, some of the cells, they increase in size and they become colorless and they become somewhat transparent in appearance. So such cells are called as heterocyst cells. So these heterocysts are some colorless, transparent, empty cells actually, where the filament becomes weak at that point, and this filament, when it becomes weak by itself, or in other words automatically, the filament will break at that point, and thus the fragments are formed. So each fragment is called as harmogone. So this is called as harmogone formation. So we see in some blue-green algae the harmogone formation, and even there are structures what are called as protonema, tubers, bulbils, amylum starch. So on the algae filaments, or in case of certain higher multicellular algae like massive forms which I have mentioned, there they produce some multicellular structures on their surface. So these multicellular structures, which are small spherical bodies, they are called as bulbils, or sometimes there are small bud-like structures, as we see certain buds in the angiosperm plants, apical bud, lateral bud, and so on. Similarly, on the surface of some multicellular algae, there are small protuberances or projections which are resembling a bud-like structure, so they are called as protonema. So the protonema may be primary protonema or secondary protonema. So that means the primary protonema gives rise to another one called as secondary, and then the secondary protonema gives rise to a new organism. That is also one method of vegetative reproduction. Then the formation of bulbils, which are some spherical bodies, they separate from the main plant and they develop into the new organism. So that is vegetative type of methods which we can mention. Then in case of asexual methods, there are again different ways. So usually this method takes place by the production of structures called as zoospores, and also there are also spores called as hypnospores. In addition to these, there are also planospores, and there are also ectospores, autospores, and endospores, parietal spores, and also monospores. Different type of spores are produced by different algae. So the way of appearance, the way of formation is different in different algae. So in some algae there are specific cells which gives rise to these structures called as spores. So this zoospores, they are usually produced during favorable conditions. When the algae is present in a favorable place, either it is aquatic or terrestrial. So favorable means it is not the only the food and water which is necessary for their development. So the environmental factors, they are also very important. The temperature, the humidity. So when the algae is present in as a lithophytic or aerophytic condition, so there the humidity is also very important. So that the habitat, the temperature of the habitat is also necessary. So when we say favorable, it does not mean that it should be provided with food and water. So that is nutrition. So environmental factors also help. It is also necessary for the method of this reproduction. So zoospores are formed especially during the favorable conditions of that algae. So zoospores are unicellular structures. So these zoospores are usually motile. They contain flagella, and when they are released, they are carried to different directions, and when they reach a suitable place, so then they develop into they germinate and they develop into a new kind of organism. But hypnospores are different. So hypnospores, these are produced only during unfavorable conditions. So when the conditions are unfavorable, so that means just I had mentioned, so merely the providing food and water is not enough for the favorable condition. So the organism, algae, also requires suitable temperature, suitable environmental conditions like humidity and also the wind or whatever it is. So all even light also plays an important role. So light also is necessary for the functioning of the cells. So that is why when the algae is facing some kind of unfavorable conditions environmentally or like that, then they develop, or that algae will develop hypnospores. And these hypnospores are structures which are remaining in the unfavorable conditions, and then they are capable of developing into a new organism after this unfavorable, when the favorable conditions they reach. So that is about the this asexual reproduction. So when in a different algae we find different kinds of spores which are found. But whenever the spores are found, there are certain stages which are seen. They are called as the specialized stages, we can say. For example, in Chlamydomonas we come across a stage called as Pamela stage, and in certain, for example, in case of Volvox, there is a stage called as daughter collies stage, and in case of Vaucheria there is Gangroceros stage, which is also seen during the development of that method. And when we come to the third type of method, sexual method of reproduction. So here we come across the male and female organs which are developed in that algae. And again in the sexual type of reproduction, we come across three types here. Isogamous type of reproduction and heterogamous type of reproduction, or isogamy and heterogamy, homogamy it is also referred as. Here the male and female gametes which are produced by the organism, they are similar to each other. Now suppose this is a male gamete and this is the female gamete. So when we cannot differentiate which is male and which is female, they are resembling same, or they are having morphologically same appearance, and thus they are called as homogamy or isogamy. So in case of isogamous, certain algae, they produce same kind of gametes, so that is called as this isogamy or homogamy. But these can be differentiated only when they fuse to form a single cell called as zygote. That is about the homogamy and all that. Then in case of heterogamous, the gametes are different. That means usually the male gamete and the female gamete are different in appearance, not only in size and even in structure also. Usually the female gamete will be somewhat larger than the male, and sometimes the female gamete may be non-motile also. It may not possess flagella. But in case of homogamy or isogamy, both the gametes possess flagella, and thus the gametes are not differentiated clearly. They are similar to each other. But in case of heterogamy, where we can also differentiate into two types, anisogamy and oogamy. This is another type. So when the gametes are produced which are of different appearance, which can be differentiated either by their size or this structure and all that, that is anisogamy. But when the same gametes are produced in a particular type of organs, so here there are specific organs where the gametes are produced. So like Antheridia and Archegonia, or the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part, so that is called as oogamy. So the gametes are produced in specialized parts or the parts of the body, that is called as oogamy. So like that in primitive forms we usually find this vegetative method, but in higher forms of algae we find both asexual and sexual. But in still massive forms, especially in case of brown algae, we come across this sexual method by the production of gametes, either isogametes or heterogametes. So this is about the reproduction in algae. Then if you come to the classification of algae, how these algae are classified. So when we speak of this classification, there is a opinion of difference of opinion between or among the scientists. So each one, they classify algae according to their own method, and certain algae, they are classified into separate groups. For example, if you take the modern classification which is followed in the lower classes, living organisms are classified into 5 kingdoms like Monera, Protista, fungi, plants and animals. There are 5 kingdoms according to Whitaker's classification. But however, there is also another classification which is proposed by Copeland, another scientist. He classified the organisms into 4 kingdoms, and another scientist like Ernst Haeckel, a German scientist, he classified into 3 kingdoms. So like that, there are different authors, scientists, which classify organisms and these plants and animals according to their own system. So in some systems, the blue-green algae is considered as a separate group because it is a prokaryote, whereas green algae, red algae and brown algae, they are considered as a separate kingdom because they are eukaryotes. So prokaryotes, as we know, they are having a very simplified structure of the cell. That means the nucleus is very simple, which is called as indefinite nucleus, and which is also called as incipient nucleus. And such cells, they don't contain mitochondria, they don't contain endoplasmic reticulum or even Golgi complex in case of prokaryotes. So that is why some consider them as very primitive type of organisms, and they have kept in a separate kingdom which is referred as Monera kingdom. But the other algae like green algae, red algae, brown algae, yellowish green algae, golden brown algae, all they are eukaryotes. They are having well defined nucleus and they contain the cell organelles, so which are placed in a separate kingdom. But so here, according to the modern classification or the modern algologists, the science of algae is called as algology. One who studies about algae, it is actually called as phycology also. So phyco means algae. So the science of algae, the study of algae is called as phycology, and commonly it is also referred as algology. So the modern phycologists or algologists, so they divide the algae. They consider all algae under one group, whether it is blue-green algae, yellowish-brown algae or red algae, brown algae. So they consider them under one group. For example, they consider one division as blue-green algae Cyanophyta. So now each, that means they have classified into 11 divisions, we can mention. So the modern phycologists, they classify algae into 11 groups, what they refer it as divisions. Now one division is the Cyanophyta, which is including the blue-green algae like Nostoc, Oscillatoria, Anabina and all that. And each division is again divided into classes. For example, this Cyanophyta includes one class called as the Cyanophyceae, and this class Cyanophyceae is again divided into different groups which are called as orders. So there are 7 orders under Cyanophyceae. So different orders like Nostocalis and Oscillatorialis and so on. So they classify this under Cyanophyta. And all the green algae, they classify under Chlorophyta. So those algae which contain purely green pigment, they are included under, and they are called as the green algae. So it also includes only one class, that is Chlorophyceae, and there are 9 orders under this class. and each order contains families, and families contains this genus and species or various examples. And there is one more group called as Charophyta. So among the green algae, there are some well advanced examples like Chara and various other examples, where the appearance of the algae is somewhat developed. There are small leaf-like structures. There is a stem-like structure in such algae, and they are included under a separate group called as Charophyta. Similarly, the Euglena is also included under Euglena phyta, because Euglena contains chlorophyll, and this Euglena is capable of this photosynthesis, and hence it is included under this Euglena phyta. And there is one more kingdom or this division called as Pyrophyta, and there is another kingdom like Xanthophyta, where it contains xanthophyll, that is a yellowish orange pigment. So this Xanthophyta includes various kinds of examples. So it is having also a class called as this Xanthophyce, and like that this Bacillariophyta is another example, which includes the diatoms. So there is one class under this division called as Bacillariophyce, and it includes this diatoms. And similarly Chrysophyta, and there is Phaeophyta, that is the brown algae, and there is Rhodophyta, and these are the certain divisions which they come under this algae. So that is why the modern phycologists, they classify the algae into 11 divisions, but there are also certain phycologists which classify algae into 9 divisions or even more number of divisions. So this is about the structure of or the study of algae. So thank you.